Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Making Suburban Lands, Working Lands webinar. My name is Lori Lilly. I'm the Executive Director of Howard Ecoworks. I'll be your host and moderator this evening. I'm going to introduce our speakers to you. Tonight we have a couple staff and a couple guest speakers to present. We have Jenny Wienckowski, who is on our staff. She's our landscape design manager. Ted Wolfe, who's our operations director. And we have two guest speakers, Michael Judd, who's the technical director of silviculture and author, as well as Keith Ohlinger, who's one of our favorite farmers and also a businessman. This is what we're going to be going over today. First, Michael Judd will provide an overview of edible landscapes with some specificity on the American chestnut. Then Jenny and Ted will review some best practices, particularly guilds, berm and basin swales, and community tree plantings. Then we will move into different applications on a small farm with a focus more on production, and this will be discussed by Jenny and include feedback from our favorite farmer, Keith. And then we'll have some questions at the end and wrap up. So we ask that you type your questions into the Q&A section in the middle of the bottom of your screen. If your question's directed to a particular speaker, you can please indicate that so we know. And then please feel free to communicate with each other in the chat box as you've already been doing. We do have a lot of guests. We'd love to know where you're chiming in from. So if you could chat, go ahead and put that into the chat box, that would be great. Lastly, as promised, the first 30 registrants, we're going to receive lupin seeds. So if they showed up here today, you will get those in the mail within a week or so. And also we are grateful to those folks that made a donation. And we will also be sending you a packet of lupin seeds as well. So thank you very much for your support. Just to tell you a little bit about Howard Ecoworks, we are a regional force for social and environmental change. We engage and educate the community about environmental sustainability and restoration while creating pathways to green jobs through our workforce development programs. We are pretty new, only having been operating since 2017, but we feel like we are having a big impact in leading and innovating in the areas of environment, workforce development, and the nexus of these areas. We provide services for design, installation, and maintenance of small to medium-sized pest management practices. We also operate a native plant nursery at our local corrections department where we grow native plants for our projects while providing rehabilitation and education opportunities to the inmate population. Lastly, we provide a lot of critical support to Howard County government, specifically for implementation of the Safe and Sound Plan and support of flood remediation in Ellicott City. Our project, Making Suburban Lands, Working Lands, is a multifaceted initiative funded by Chesapeake Bay Trust and Howard County government. It builds on our previous programs, the Ellicott City Soak It Up campaign and our Tree Hoko campaign. It has a goal of engaging private property landowners in different types of built landscape projects that increase the ecological value and resiliency of what would be currently open space lawn areas. And we do that with tree plantings, perennial agricultural planting, and passive rainwater harvesting. In addition to the built projects, we have education and outreach goals associated with our work that, of course, has been modified due to COVID. This webinar is helping us to meet those goals, in addition to a previous webinar that we did with silviculture on the economics of chestnuts, and a third webinar recording that is currently being edited and will go into detail on how to construct the berm and swale basins. Through our project, we've worked with many different land types and property sizes, including 13 landowners and 2 homeowner associations. Some motivated homeowners wanted more than just trees. They were excited to add a community of plants to their yards, and to these we added berry-producing shrubs, an array of pollinator-friendly perennials and ground covers that Jenny and Ted will be talking to you about. We've traditionally focused on rain gardens as our primary built project to slow the flow. And through this project, we've been really excited to expose both our work crews and the public to a wider variety of project types that provide a lot of different benefits. So let's get to it. We're excited to have Michael Judd join us this evening of Silviculture. They have been a really great partner with us on this project. Silviculture is also a nonprofit whose goal is to plant 1 million nut trees in the Mid-Atlantic. And Michael has a tremendous amount of knowledge and experience to share. You will get a glimpse of that this evening as he discusses a few of the tree species featured in our edible landscapes. We definitely encourage you to check out his books, his workshops, his Pawpaw Festival, and all of his other cool endeavors. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Michael.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Lori. Thanks, everybody at Howard County Ecoworks, everybody tuning in tonight. It's going to be a fruitful year. I can see that already by looking around at the nurseries that everything's selling out, which is pretty exciting. That means people are tuning in and getting ready to plant this year. So let's jump right in. Pawpaws, right? Most people have heard of pawpaws by now. Some are calling it the hipster banana. It's become so popular of late. But this tree is millions of years old. It has really had a very unique story in that it is the only member of the tropical and subtropical family called the Annona family. Most people know the custard apple, the cherimoya, the soursop of that family. And what's unique about the pawpaw is that it migrated north from modern day northern Mexico, southern US, all the way up into modern day southern Ontario. And it did this on receding glaciers in the guts of giant sloths and mastodons, just slowly and amazingly adapting from the tropics all the way into the frigid north. So there's nothing like the pawpaw in our woods, in our landscapes at all. It is really a tropical tree that has adapted to grow in the north. And the fruit is exquisite. I lived in the tropics for 18 years, and largely in rural Latin America, where I grew food forests and lots of fruits, nuts, bamboos, palms, everything. Many of the same members of this pawpaw family. So I've had the good fortune to try a lot of wonderful fruits, and I consider the pawpaw to be really one of the most amazing. Hold on, Barbara Hopkins. Wow, that's interesting. Sorry, I was looking down at the chats there. Barbara Hopkins passed about 2 months ago, so I'm glad she's here in spirit. So the pawpaw, aside from being a delicious fruit, and I'll get to that here in a minute, is a beautiful tree, what I call an edible landscaping all-star. And by that, I mean that it's easy to grow, it's low maintenance, it's beautiful, and it's tasty. That's what it takes to become an edible landscape all-star in my books. Now, a lot of people know the pawpaw to grow in the deep shade of the woods, which it does. Usually in the woods, it grows as a patch, a multi-suckering patch, maybe in deep shade, 8-10 feet tall. If you get it in partial sun, partial light, it grows tall and lanky, maybe like 20-25 feet, and is partially fruitful. Now you bring that pawpaw out into full sun, it's going to become this beautiful pyramid-shaped tree, typically between 15 to 25 feet tall, and it will produce an abundant amount of fruit. So full sun, full fruit. Remember that. Partial sun, partial fruit. Full shade, no fruit. So really bringing the pawpaw out and celebrating it in our landscapes is a tasty endeavor. So this also goes back to the adaptability of this species. This species can move out of the shade. It can come into full sun. The trick in what it needs in full sun is adequate moisture. And that is two things. That means not a windy site. And two, it means lots of mulch. Wood chips, mulch, straw, whatever, leaves, load it up. Make that ground really nice and consistently humid, and the trees will thrive. They do not like to be in a wet spot. So, a lot of people hear about them growing by the streams and the rivers. They do on the banks where they have drainage next to all that water. They don't want to be in the water. So if you have a wet spot, the roots will rot and ferment and the tree will die, right? So near water, near humidity, but needs drainage, out of wind. And otherwise they thrive. They do so well here. Once you start to recognize the pawpaw, you'll see it everywhere in the landscape. It really grows wild. Go ahead, let's see the next slide. Beautiful fall foliage as well. Beautiful golden hue to add. And then I think it has a beautiful winter habit in the shape of the tree and the twigs. It's a beauty. Now let's check out the next slide. Now in my food forests and my orchards here, I keep my pawpaws at about 8 to 10 feet max. And it's actually very easy to keep the pawpaws at that height, basically by holding down that central leader with annual pruning. So you can fit them into a small space, a small yard, and typical spacing for them is 10 to 12 feet apart. So these actually can, graft easily into a smaller landscape. And of course you need 2 for cross-pollination, but more the merrier. They do like to be in patches, but 2 is typically, sufficient for getting your fruit. And if you have good genetics, meaning not a wild fruit per se, but something that's been cultivated, you can expect potentially 35 plus pounds of fruit per tree. So these are major producers of fruit. Here's the fruit on the top there. That is what you might more likely find in the common. If you're walking along the C&O Canal or somewhere and you see a pawpaw, that's not uncommon. That's the size. Inside of that, there are large, dark brown lima bean side seeds. So in a wild pawpaw, that could be, that could have 8 seeds in it, which means you got a very little bit amount of pulp. And the pulp can be anywhere from astringent and maybe tannic to very sweet. So there are good wild pawpaws. Don't get me wrong. There are good wild pawpaws, but it kind of takes a fruit hunter to find those or to know that it is. So the benefit we have of growing our own pawpaws is getting really good genetics. There's been wonderful cultivation of the pawpaw for hundreds of years. In the last 100 years, it's really accelerated. In the last 50 years, it's really gone high in the sense that we now have wonderful cultivars and select seedlings. So from a select genetics, you can expect a large mango-sized fruit, 1 to 2 pounds, that will have very few seeds in it. So, have a low seed ratio to pulp. And that pulp will have wonderful, sweet, aromatic flavor notes, pineapple, mango, banana, just absolutely exquisite. No bitterness, no tannins, just one of the best fruits you've ever had. It's like dessert. It's actually hard to eat more than one. And speaking of dessert, it makes great ice cream. It value adds into smoothies. You can freeze it, and it freezes well for a year or more. So that's the trick too, because they don't have a long shelf life. You want to ideally hand pick them when they're starting to turn, pulp them, freeze it, and enjoy it for the rest of the year. Otherwise, 2 or 3 days after they're ripe, they're like a banana, and they gotta be eaten or put in the compost. But save those seeds. We have a pawpaw festival here, 3rd Saturday every September. We just posted our tickets for it. I highly encourage everyone to get tickets because we do sell out. And it's a great opportunity to come and try lots of different types of pawpaws, come see our food forests, learn about pawpaws. We have music. You can come check out this circular straw bale house that we built. It's a real fun, festive day. The pawpaw is just kind of the headliner. All right, let's keep moving. What do we got next? Oh, and then of course, one of the benefits of planting the pawpaws is this beautiful zebra swallowtail butterfly, for which the pawpaw is the sole host. So you want to see these beauties more, you got to plant your pawpaw trees. All right. All right, so chestnuts. Laura, you'd said American, but no, we're not talking about American chestnuts here. That's a whole nother movement, right? There is, most of you are probably familiar with the American chestnut revival, working on it, slowly coming back. We are not focused on that. I'm not focused on that. There are many species of chestnuts around the world. The Europeans have their collection. Asia has their collection. You know, the chestnut at one point was probably a mother tree, and then it's adapted to these different environments. Another very highly adapted species here. And so there's been variations, and the genetics that have been worked with the most culturally are the ones in Asia. And they have extensive orchards, and the trees there are super productive. They're only about 30 to 40 feet tall, beautiful ornamental, umbrella-shaped tree. I'll show you, maybe the next slide will show us one here. Of a hybrid chestnut, again, mainly Asian genetics that we're working with. We are after trees that are consistently productive, annually productive, and the chestnut produces every year a amazing amount. So a mature tree size like this could easily produce 100 pounds of nuts per tree every year. And the chestnuts are delicious. They're carbohydrate rich, which means that they don't, like most nuts, have oils in them, which makes them great for storing, making flour out of, making pastries, you know, making chestnut gnocchi. You know, I mean, you can make pasta with this. I mean, it's called the grain tree, basically because it has been that for many cultures throughout history, especially during times of strife, where there's been shortages of food. The chestnut has been a survival tree. So it is so important on so many layers. But then it is also very economically viable, because currently the US is importing 88% of the chestnuts it consumes, right? So why are we importing something that we can grow better here? And the challenge with chestnuts, to a degree, is how they're stored and how they're kept and how they're shipped. So most chestnuts you're buying that have come from distance are not good quality anymore. So growing chestnuts here in country makes a huge amount of economic sense, ecological sense, and basic food security sense. And they're beautiful, and they're fast growing, they're tough, they're drought resistant once they get going, they're wildlife food. I mean, I couldn't be more excited about something than I am the chestnut, for good reasons. And yeah, here's a picture I took at Mom's organic grocery store a year or so ago. Look at that, 20 bucks a pound. Now, they shouldn't be storing them out like that. You should store your chestnuts like you would carrots. You know, keep them cool, keep them a little bit moist. It's a living seed. So a lot of times, again, you're not really getting the full experience of how wonderful a chestnut is. And just like the pawpaw, sometimes you've got to grow them to have that experience. So I highly recommend learning more about the hybrid chestnuts. And you can do that by visiting silvoculture.org, nonprofit that I helped co-found 2 years ago. And we're focused on nut trees. We're focused on perennial tree crops in general. So we also are very excited about black walnuts, American persimmons, pawpaws, etc. Hazelnuts are coming up. But the chestnut is definitely the leader for all of the reasons that I mentioned. And this is an orchard just down the street from here in Frederick. Both the pictures I've showed you are in Frederick of the trees, and they're just majestical. They create almost an estate-like feeling. So again, another edible landscape all-star. How's that?
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Michael, for all your enthusiasm and your insight into those fruit trees, the fruit and nut trees that you've discussed here with us. So I'm going
Great.
to bring us, oh yeah, thank you. Bring us back around to talking about some of the landscape projects that we here at Ecoworks were installing as part of this Make Suburban Lands Working Lands grant. Let's start with lawns. Lawns are a relatively new cultural phenomenon, and they've really become so popular that they basically dominate the suburban landscape. In our Chesapeake Bay watershed alone, which measures to nearly 41 million acres, nearly 10% or 3.8 million acres of that is lawn. And that's just a mind-boggling amount of grass. So what's the problem exactly? What's the matter with grass? Why are we looking to encourage people to transform their lawns into something more productive? In short, you can see from this slide that there's not much to turf grass. It just doesn't work as hard as a more complex ecosystem. The shallow roots really barely hold on to the soil and don't do much to help the infiltration of stormwater or even preventing erosion. So while lawns are great for picnics and playing sports, it's essentially a one-dimensional landscape. A true dynamic and resilient landscape has an entire ecosystem composed of many different plants that fill varying niches, providing food and habitat to critters ranging from microorganisms in the soil to birds, mammals, and even some of the bigger predator type animals that we like to think about. Really, livestock and geese are the only animals that really like to eat grass, let's be honest. So humans also benefit from these more complex ecosystems and also benefit from the landscapes that try to mimic a more complex ecosystem. We call these benefits ecosystem services. And basically that's a phrase that we use to describe things like food, clean air and water, shade that cools our roofs and roads, and that overall sense of fulfillment that we get from our recreational and spiritual experiences in nature. So hopefully you get a sense of why we're trying to transform the typical suburban landscape into more of a working landscape with the addition of a few choice fruit and nut shrubs and trees. So what can you do to transform your yard into a productive landscape? Simply planting a couple trees or a couple shrubs and some perennials to attract pollinators is one thing. Placing the right native plants that like to soak up water in an area of your yard where the ground's particularly soggy and doesn't drain well and the grass doesn't grow so well are great options. Simply planting trees on a slope or a bare swath of grass in the landscape. All of these simple actions can be enhanced by including fruit and nut trees among the plants. And so as we discuss these projects here today, we're going to be highlighting some of the selected trees and shrubs that we found are suitable for suburban yards. We're primarily focusing on native plants that are more suited to the climate of the Mid-Atlantic region here. And of course, these plants are just as attractive and durable as traditional landscape plants, but they have the added benefit of providing food for both wildlife and people alike. So we'll move into discussing in a little bit more detail a guild planting. A guild planting is a concept that comes from the field of permaculture. And you may have heard of permaculture. It's basically the melding of traditional agricultural techniques with more modern approach to growing perennial production gardens, things that will, you're your traditional annual vegetable bed. We're talking about things that are more woody or perennial and come back on their own each year and don't necessarily require seeding and planting every single year. So a guild is a multi-dimensional array of plants, a group of plants that work together to support one another and provide services to one another within the guild. Often they have a larger fruit tree or a nut tree as the centerpiece plant. And then the layers beneath that canopy tree feature other useful plants as well. There's shrubs and smaller understory trees taking advantage of the air circulation below the canopy tree. And then at the ground level, we have all kinds of plants that have different working roles. We have ground cover that works to suppress weeds and conserve moisture at the soil level. There's varying layers of pollinator-friendly plants that draw both pollinators that then go on to pollinate the fruit and nut trees that are present, and also plants that draw beneficial insects or birds that may serve to pluck off those pest insects that may be plaguing our plants in the environment. And then another plant that we like to feature in a guild planting is a nitrogen fixer. These are some of the plants from the legume family that are known to draw nitrogen out of the atmosphere and process it and transport it into the soil, and where they store it in nodes along their roots, where it's readily available for other plants grown in the vicinity to sort of take advantage of that additional fertilizer, naturally occurring fertilizer in the soil. Some of the trees that could be the centerpiece of a guild are the persimmon. That's a native to much of the eastern United States. That's a lovely tree. It's maybe about 35 to 45 feet tall, sort of sparsely branched. It's not a heavy canopy. They're maybe more narrow than the chestnut for sure. Just a couple notes about the persimmon. This is another one where you want 2 or more plants to kind of really get good fruit set and cross-pollination, really to have an abundance of the fruit come about. The tree flowers in the spring, and then those small, let's say they're smaller than an apple, but larger than a grape tomato. Those fruits become ripe really late in the fall, close to Thanksgiving, honestly. Another potential tree for the centerpiece of a guild would be something like a pig nut hickory. This is another one that's not too large. They fit really well into a residential landscape. They're only, in the mid canopy height range. They tolerate a wide variety of conditions, and although for the most part, as Michael mentioned earlier, most of these trees like nice moist soil to get established, and well drained is a key feature also. So finding that happy place is important for these canopy trees. And talking a little bit about some of the shrubs that we could have in the layer right below the canopy layer, we could try something like a high bush blueberry. A lot of people aren't so familiar with the fact that these are native to the U.S. They have a fantastic fruit production, and of course, as with a lot of these other fruit trees and shrubs, you want to have some cross-pollination. So you want to maybe plant more than one, a small group or a patch of the berries will really help to ensure that you have good fruit production. There's a ton of varieties out there, and we just want to be sure that you choose ones that have a similar bloom time so that the pollination can happen, the cross-pollination can occur. And so you want to note words like early or late in the variety name, and choose ones that work well together. Another one of our favorite edible landscape shrubs is the chokeberry. This one's a little less common than the blueberry, but they're also fantastic shrubs. That the straight species can get to be, large shrub or small tree size. 6 to 10 feet is quite large. The red chokeberry is a suckering plant, so if you plant one or two, you'll soon have a thicket of them, and that's great because the birds, of course, really love the fruit as well. These have a really attractive white flower in the spring, and then they fruit later in the midsummer. So here's diving right into the projects here. This is the guild planting. This was a small residential lot, about 1/4 of an acre. That's actually not so small, but this is a single family home in a typical suburban setting with a highly visible location. So we really wanted to make sure this was an attractive landscape in addition to being productive. The plan was developed in part by silviculture, and so they, with input from the homeowner, they came up with a really complex guild that we worked to install. The layers here feature a pig nut hickory as the canopy layer, and then a pawpaw, 2 pawpaws as the secondary understory layer, and then the 2 shrubs that we just spoke about. In addition, there's the ground cover layer where we focused on having 3 full seasons of blooming, pollinator attracting perennials. We have things like golden ragwort and blue false indigo for our spring blooming, and then the summer blooms include bee balm and coreopsis, mountain mint, which is a true pollinator magnet, and also attracting the beneficial wasps that serve to get rid of some of the problematic insects also that may be plaguing the fruit. So here's the site after we're finished planting, and honestly, it looks like a traditional garden. I don't think you could look at it and necessarily know that it was a production garden. You can see that the layers there, and sort of catch a glimpse of the trees and how we use the woody plants to reinforce the fence line. These are all native plants in this landscape, and so it'd be really exciting to see how this grows and develops over the years. So now I'm going to turn things over to Ted Wolfe, who's going to talk some about the simple earthworks we've used to capture stormwater.
Great, thank you, Jenny, and good evening, everyone. Thanks again for attending. As mentioned earlier, my name is Ted Wolfe. I'm the Operations Director here at Howard Ecoworks. And the first project I'm going to be talking about tonight is the berm and basin swale, quite literally what it says. And we're going to go into detail about how it's created and how it's designed. But first, I kind of wanted to talk about a concept that's prevalent across all turfed lawns, and it's called sheet flow. And it happens pretty much anywhere where the grade is relatively flat. And so essentially sheet flow is how water moves across a lot of these turf grass lawns. If you look at your lawn in a rain event, that's really the best time to tell where water is moving. You can see water either flowing in channels or just via a sheet kind of over the entire landscape downhill. Obviously water is always going to go with the path of least resistance, and so it's always going to find the quickest way downhill. Sheet flow water is really difficult to detect, and that's really the focus of the project we're going to be talking about here, the berm and basin swale. We're going to be building a swale on a contour or a set elevation line in order to passively capture some of that water and use it to our advantage. So here, as I mentioned, this is a kind of a planned and engineered project, a little bit more so than a guild planting like Jenny mentioned, although that is still something we obviously plan and design before installing. So this map here shows a typical contour map. You see in the dotted yellow lines, those are the actual contours. In the solid yellow lines, you have other contours in increments of 10. The dotted yellow lines are increments of 2 feet. And basically what we have is arrows showing the flow of water sheet flowing across this property. What we want to do with the contours is we want to build a berm and basin swale along the contour line, so parallel to the contour line or right on top of it. What's important about that is we're maintaining the elevation of the project in order to ensure we know how water is going to flow into and through the project in the event of rain. So one big note here is water always flows perpendicular to the contour lines. So here's a cutaway version of the berm and basin swale to kind of give you a better idea of what it looks like. On the left side of the photo, you see an arrow pointing into it, and that's the sheet flow water coming downhill, if you can imagine on like the map we just showed. And then on the right side of the photo, you have the berm, which is another word for an earthen hill. In this sense, what we do is we design it on the contour, dig out the basin, and use that soil to then create the berm downhill. So uphill, we have a small swale, or basin in this case. Downhill of that, we have a little berm, and that's going to act as a wall, essentially, to pond the water and capture it into that little basin. Then the water can kind of function for us at that point. We've captured in this small little area, and we can use it to feed plants that are put on the berm, such as trees, as we'll see in a little bit. And we can also let the water soak into the ground, letting it recharge groundwater and be treated in that sense. Similar to a rain garden, but not in the sense where it's ponding water for multiple days. So that's the main goal of the berm and basin swale. And so now we go back to the topographical map where you can see a berm and basin swale designed along a contour line. So as I mentioned before, the contour line is solid in this case. You see the two basins designed in light blue, and just south or just downhill of that, you have the berm. On the berm, you also notice there's 3 hybrid chestnuts that we planned for this particular planting. So we planted those in the constructed berm, and that's also a dual function, as I mentioned, how the water will filter into the basin and help feed the roots of those chestnut trees as they grow and mature. So next, because this is a little bit of a more complicated project, it's a little bit harder to envision. I want to kind of go through the sequence of how we built one of these berm and basin swales. So the first step really is to lay it out, and this is, I can't state it enough, this is the most important step of the entire project. We have to accurately find the correct elevation that we want and make sure that we build the entire project along the elevation. Elevations are very tricky, and you cannot trust your eyes, especially when it comes to a matter of differences of 3 to 4 inches. So what we use is a combination of some tools, an optical level, as well as an A-frame to help locate the elevation, the contour that we're looking to build the project on, and maintain that. So here you see just a profile view of the project in the works, and some flags just going along to show the contour. And even in this picture, it looks like they're not on the same elevation. And that's kind of why I stress, don't ever trust your eyes. Always use some sort of measurements and tools to really determine where the contour is. Next slide. So once we've laid out the entire project and we understand the contour we're on, we can then begin to actually start excavating. So we mark out the basin portion and the berm portion of the project from the design plans. And then we begin to excavate the basin, and then using that soil, we'll build the berm. So here you see the crew excavating. You can kind of begin to see the basin forming, and then the berm, which is just that little exposed dirt hill right in front of some of the workers. Next slide. So all along the way, it's really important to check our elevations, and that's what you see them doing here. One worker right in the middle of the photo is holding a long pole, and that's a way that we measure in conjunction with the person all the way on the right using the optical level to verify that we have the correct elevation. And so moving along the length of the project, we verified, after a little bit of digging, we'd make sure that we hit the correct depth, and we make sure that we're not building the berm too high, just to keep it all within project specs. And that way we can ensure we know how the water is going to flow through the project and work to our advantage. Next slide. Again, kind of checking elevations here. Even when you think you've got it all set, it's always good to just continue checking to make sure it's good to go. That's on the left photo. And on the right photo, we've learned from experience it's really important to plan on regrading the uphill portion. And that's really something that we've taken into account for our designs going forward, is making sure that we have a nice gentle slope going into the berm and basin swale for a number of reasons. We don't want any water flowing into the swale to pick up any speed unduly from any changes we'd make to the grade. Furthermore, we also just don't want to be a drop in the grade, so there's just a drastic elevation change between the basin itself and the uphill grade. That would create, if you can envision, a shelf, which would just expose more soil and potentially cause erosion down the line. So it's very important to regrade the uphill portion and even the downhill portion, downhill of the berm itself, to avoid the same problems where you have drastic changes in elevation, which can introduce erosion and just start creating problems with every rain. Next slide. So once we have the basin created and the berm made, the next step really is to plant. And so for a lot of our berm and basin swales, we designed chestnuts to be planted on the berm itself. So in this particular practice, we had 3 hybrid chestnuts that were planted within the berm. And we all used planter tubes to protect the chestnuts while all still giving them light. And we used a combination, what we called lasagna mulching, where we would use multiple materials such as regular mulch, as you see there, but also cardboard to protect the ground around the tree and also hold in the moisture and act as a better form of mulch and a longer term form of mulch for these practices. Next slide. And there you see the completed project. So in this case, we decided to put grass, or straw rather, inside of the actual basin itself and on the berm. Another alternative, if you want this to kind of seamlessly kind of transition into your lawn, is to grass seed this. I know we talked about turf grass not being the best, but that is just an option for ease of maintenance, depending on how you use your property and other characteristics involved. That's also not to say that you can't put more native plants in these practices as well. We focused on the planting of these hybrid chestnuts and the construction of the berm and basin swale in order to ensure the water gets to them. But this is not to say you can't put more natives such as perennials and ground covers and other aspects of the guild planting that Jenny talked about earlier into one of these berm and basin swales. Great. So the next project that I like to talk about is trees in the community. And this is one of my favorite things to do just in general, planting trees for reasons. I do think it's one of the lower hanging fruits in terms of environmental practices. Every tree matters. Anyone that has property can plant a tree somewhere. And we're going to talk to you a little bit about how to do that right now and things that you can consider. So this is a great thing that I like to tell everyone about because not everyone seems to understand or know that Howard County has a green infrastructure network, GIN for short. So this green infrastructure network shown here is a system of corridors and hubs. The orange little areas are the hubs and the brown trails are corridors. And what this is intended to do is to preserve wild lands for the flora and fauna here in Howard County to live and traverse and move across the county as they normally would before all the development happened and man kind of took over a lot of the space. So there's a lot of benefits that come about from having this interconnectedness of wildlife for flora and fauna, and a lot of properties actually are either inside of the GIN or border the GIN. So it's almost like a community infrastructure network in that sense that a lot of people are taking care of this, and a lot of people have responsibility to make sure that it's doing as much ecosystem services as Jenny mentioned as before. Next slide. All right, so before you plant a tree, it is important to consider a few things. We're always very aware of looking in the ground for utilities ahead of any projects that we do, but with trees, you also need to think above the ground. So as I showed in the last slide, the Green Infrastructure Network has lots of corridors. A lot of corridors too are created by utilities and right-of-ways from utilities. That's something that you obviously need to be aware of if you're going to plant any trees and project how big the trees will get over time, so you can adjust your planting plan or the species that you incorporate to avoid any potential problems in the future. Next slide. Yep, and this is where I was talking about below the ground. So that's kind of above the ground. Below the ground, we always call Miss Utility before we do any sort of excavation, be it a tree planting or a guild planting, because you're never quite sure what's below ground. So anytime you want to plant a tree, even if it's on your own property, I'd highly recommend submitting a Miss Utility request, which is free, for them to come out and mark any of those utilities that you may encounter. Great. So to go through one of our community tree planting projects, this is an aerial map that shows the planting plan for a community in the Tiber Hudson watershed. This was part of our Ellicott City Soak It Up initiative. So we did this planting last year, and we did it in a couple areas in the community. So this is just one of the areas. So in this case, we have a list of different trees, understory, canopy, and then the locations of these trees. We've taken a number of considerations into account when developing this plan, such as the heat island effect, community usage of these spaces, and then obviously utilities and any other hazards we might encounter along the way. So this was designed in conjunction with the community to best make sure that they would have as much ownership and happiness from the project, and they would feel empowered and compelled to take care of these trees as they reach maturity. The next slide will kind of go into some of the trees that we've incorporated into this. So to kind of show two ends of the spectrum, I'm going to introduce you to a really popular tree we use, serviceberry. It tends to be a little bit shorter. Here you can see its statistics about, or its characteristics and what it prefers in terms of full sun and moist, well-drained soil. Serviceberry is also a really pretty tree. It attracts lots of birds and it produces a lot of food for birds. So it's something that we recommend a lot to provide that specific ecosystem service. It's also a great tree for smaller yards. As I mentioned, tree planting is something anyone can do, and I know everyone's yard is of a different size, but this is one that would suffice for a smaller property. It's also a better understory tree, and it's a good one for along woodland edges. So that kind of speaks to folks who might live along the green infrastructure network or any wooded area. This would be a good one for that edge between typical land that's lawn and the wooded areas itself. On the next slide, we kind of have the opposite end of the spectrum. Black walnuts, which many people are probably familiar with. These grow much larger over the course of their lifetime. And they also provide food for people and for animals as well. This is an interesting tree as well. Every plant has unique characteristics about it. But this one produces a chemical in its roots and leaves called Jugalone. And that one actually can kill a lot of garden vegetables and susceptible plants. So that speaks a little bit to, if you're going to use a black walnut, it's probably a better idea to research what plants are most resistive to Jugalone. And hint, hint, it's going to be more native plants than it is exotics. So that's something to consider if you're planting black walnuts in just any trees or any species in general. A lot of them have specific characteristics and unique properties that may affect other plants. All right, next slide. This is describing our tree planting technique. Many folks haven't planted a tree before, and so it's always a good idea to go through the process of how to properly plant a tree. There's a lot of different small steps you can take to ensure that the tree is going to have a better survival. And outlined here, you see some of the steps such as creating a hole that's 3 times as big as a tree. We like to use the saying, dig a $30 hole for a $10 tree, and that'll eventually make it turn into hopefully hundreds of dollars a tree when it reaches maturity. So we dig a large hole. We also break up any bound roots, which is a very common thing when you buy trees in pots. The roots tend to just kind of grow in a circle, and that can really inhibit the tree from spreading out into the soil around it once you get it out of that pot. We also add compost and a little bit of biochar to almost every tree that we plant to kind of beef up the amount of organic matter in the soil. If you've thrown a shovel into your soil, you probably found a lot of clay and a lack of organic matter, depending on where you are. So compost and biochar help that out a lot. We also mulch our trees in the method of using a mulch donut, if you will. You've probably seen many trees where the mulch creeps up along the center of the tree and just kind of peaks at the tree itself. That's really a detrimental practice, and what we do is kind of the opposite, where we have a basin around the tree, and that will help capture any water that falls in that area and soak it into the roots, as opposed to shedding off of what we call the mulch volcano method. Finally, we protect our trees. As everyone's very familiar with, there's tons of deer in Howard County, partially thanks to the Green Infrastructure Network, but it's a good thing. And deer will move through our properties at any day, any time of the day. So we want to protect them from not just being eaten by deer, but also rub. Most trees can survive some deer browse, if they eat the leaves or the buds, but rub tends to be much more detrimental. And when I say rub, I mean when a buck rubs its antlers on a tree, which happens seasonally to shed their velvet, they can rip off the bark or even snap the tree in half, especially young trees. So it's something that we do to protect them is we cage them and we stake them, and we use tree ties in order to make sure that they grow upright. Next slide. Great. So here we kind of have a little demonstration, a crew planting some of our trees in the community described. You can see a tree in a pot on its side. And so if you haven't seen them before, that's what it looks like. And you can imagine how over a course of a few years, the roots just start to grow in a circle instead of spreading out because they simply can't. Next slide. Great. And so this is planting the tree. Again, just a hardworking crew member. And one more slide to show the final planted tree and protected. So here you can see we use metal caging, which will prevent the deer from getting close to the tree. And we use 2 wooden stakes with tree ties specifically to resist the outdoor elements and ensure the tree is going to grow straight. This can all be adjusted after the tree's been planted, and it's something that we pass along information and recommend everyone, take care of their trees. A little bit of maintenance every week can really save a lot of time in the future and can really help grow some mature, beautiful trees in a few decades. On that note, I would like to pass it back to Jenny to kind of talk about a combination about these projects and how we can scale it up on a larger property.
Thank you, Ted. So the last project we'd like to talk about tonight is a chestnut planting that we did on a small farm in western Howard County. So far this evening, we've really talked about how these edible landscapes can fit into your more typical suburban landscapes that you see around the Columbia area. But for those of you who live in the more rural parts of the county, this may pique your interest. Just a reminder for those of you who do have large properties and might want to scale up and try a larger scale of tree plantings, you definitely want to watch our other webinar that we did about how to grow chestnuts for profit. You can visit the resource tab on our website, www.howardecoworks.org, for this webinar, and we have a few other videos there also on some other interesting environmental topics. I'm going to let Keith Ohlinger tell you a little bit about his farm and some of the land care practices that he uses there. Just want to say in quick that this property is a nexus of all the project types that we've presented so far today. He'll tell you a little bit about it, but trust me when I say that he's already got some Burman Basin swales on site, and he's got some natives planted there already. So Keith, take it away.
Well, thank you all. I have to thank all my friends on the panel. I've never had such a well done lead in or explanation prior to doing a conference or serving as a panelist. So thank you all very much. This is a picture of our farm here in Howard County. We're in Woodbine. And what we're really talking about with all this is how do we as a species deal with an ever-growing population that requires food and clothing and building materials and energy, and not destroy the planet in the process. We're all interconnected, and what's good for one is good for all of us ultimately in our communities. And so what we're trying to do on our farm is we're taking all the practices that they mentioned, and we're trying to, farm is a business. We have to make a profit, and so we're trying to be as resilient as we can. We're trying to be as proactive as we can with working with the environment. We look back ecologically, historically, what sort of region are we in? We're in what would have historically been a chestnut oak region. So we look for natives that want to live in this region. We know climate change is changing that a little bit, so we keep that in mind as well. And what we're really doing here is we're doing commercial livestock with these permaculture principles. And so we have on our farm, Michael had mentioned the American chestnut. I'm a member of the American Chestnut Foundation, and we have several hundred of their latest B3, F3 series trees planted here. We also have several hundred of Maryland native chestnut trees that appear to have survived the blight. So we have their offspring here. We also have hybrid chestnuts that Michael mentioned, and that was what these 50 trees that they came out and planted. Now, what you'll notice here in this particular picture, you can kind of see all the tubes that are out there. I stopped counting when we hit 15,000 of trees that we planted. We planted well over that in seeds. Some don't make it, of course, but the effort was there. So in this particular planting, we have alleyways of forage. So we are technically a silvopasture. We graze heritage breed livestock on a rotational basis. So these are livestock that were once prevalent, but they're now potentially more endangered because people haven't used them as much anymore, but they thrive in a system like what we have that we're presenting to you here. And so as you come off the alleyway of forage, that's about 48 feet wide. Then you have that 5-foot alleyway where the plantings are. So on the uphill side, there's a fence to protect the tree plantings and the berry bushes that are coming in. And right before that on the uphill side is the swale. Then these are all planted on that 5-foot berm. And so there's a line of trees that's more tightly spaced. That will become a living hedge. They last for thousands of years. It's done throughout Europe historically. It's a wonderful system, great for wildlife. So that'll be protection on that side. And then in the center along the berm, on the spacing is where we have our production trees. So that they'll help for wildlife, they'll help for food production, they'll help for livestock feed. They provide shade, so some of the cooler season grasses thrive in that. It also provides some of the shelter for some of these understory species that they mentioned before. And then eventually we'll train a grapevine up each one of those trees to add extra feed for wildlife and for human consumption. And then on the south side, which is kind of the side that you see that hasn't been planted yet on this photo, we'll have more thornberry bushes and smaller species that'll be planted in that row for protection on that side. Eventually, once the living hedge and the whole system take root and are large enough to protect itself, then those metal fences will be removed eventually, and then it'll be a self-sustaining system that my family and I will just maintain. And so in this case, we planted these 50 trees, and I've known Lori for many years. She had come to this. I'm on this supervisory board for Howard Soil Conservation District, and years ago she had come out talking about natives to have a meeting with us back then. And then I've stayed in touch with her over the years in the Howard Ecoworks, and I attended Michael's presentation, virtual presentation back in July there. So I thought this was a perfect opportunity for us to all work together, and it worked out very well. So Jenny, I'll turn it back to you, I guess, or I can explain some of this stuff if you want me to.
I think essentially you've already explained it. Right. I think this is just sort of an illustrative plan to show us where the actual key lines were, or the berm basin swales are along those yellow lines on the plan. And just to remind people again, as the water flows downhill, the swale is parallel to the contour, but perpendicular to the flow of water. So yeah, we're just kind of reinforcing that. So thank you, Keith, for your introduction there and telling us a little bit about your farm and all the magnificent things you have going on there. So yeah, this is the crew hard at work. Because Keith was so generous with his time, Ecoworks was able to plant 50 trees in one day, which is a tremendous amount of trees for us. Keith was helpful in instructing the crew how to use a sort of a trench shovel to really just kind of like create a really small hole. I know that Ted had talked some about the need for a larger hole for some of these trees grown in pots, but the chestnuts that we were planting were bare roots. So they didn't require such an expansive hole, and we were able to use these trench shovels to kind of create small opportunities for installing the chestnut bare root whips right into the ground there on the berm. And essentially the crew worked in like an assembly line style to get those trees in the ground that day. And follow along behind with mulch and water and the planter tubes, and then the trees were ready to go. So I think once again, this is a pretty amazing site here. I think that expanse of trees is pretty spectacular now, but I want you all to imagine, like, what is it going to look like in 10 years and really like imagine what it's going to look in 50 years. It's going to be tremendous. I hope I'm around to see it. We'll see. But I want to remind everybody the best time to plant a tree is today, essentially, so that we are hopefully around to see its growth and to finally take advantage of some of the fruit and nuts that these trees produce for us. I really hope you all have learned something tonight. I want to just kind of share with you a few ways that you can make changes to your home landscape that will impact the ecosystem for the better. You could try a guild garden or a simple berm and basin swale, or plant a tree, and obviously you can read some of the other suggestions also. I'm going to hand things back to Lori at this time so that we can take a moment and address some of the questions you've been asking this evening.
All right, cool. So we've gotten some questions through the chat and also in the Q&A. First question, I guess for Jenny or Michael, about how much the deer like the pawpaw. Are they voraciously eating pawpaws or not?
Not mature pawpaws. So deer, especially young deer, will nibble at things as they come up, even if it's not a preferred food. So in many landscapes, a young pawpaw coming up, if it's small, can get nibbled on by young deer especially. But once it gains maturity, usually at about year 3, the leaves start to get a little tougher and more leathery, and the deer will not eat them. On our landscapes here, we have lots and lots of deer, and we have lots and lots of pawpaws. They don't eat them, even the young ones, because they know it. So I think if the deer in your area aren't used to pawpaws because they've been lost for a generation or two, the young ones might still nibble at it. So, but year 3 onwards, they're not going to touch it.
Sounds good. Thank you. Jenny, could you go to the previous slide and have that showing while we do the Q&A? That was a request. Michael, this will be for you also. Is there any concern with the hybrid chestnuts moving into aggressive or invasive status?
I wish. They can invade me all they want. No, I mean, typically the seeds and the nuts are readily consumed. It's hard to find a nut that doesn't get eaten when it comes to the chestnuts. So no, and where we have them growing, for example, there's an orchard down the street that's 60 years old on about 8 acres. It's not growing outside of that 8 acres. It hasn't naturally expanded itself in 60 years. So no, it's up to us. It's up to us to do it.
Okay, sounds good. Keith, someone asked what is planted in the small tubes behind the chestnuts?
Yes, I did put an answer in there. Those are 5 different types of native. We have northern red oak, black locust, Washington hawthorn, hazelnut, and yellow poplar in those.
Okay, very good. Michael, can you post?
Hey, hold on. Can I throw something on that? Keith, I've had good success grafting Washington hawthorns with Asian pears.
Oh,
it makes a really good rootstock.
All right, great. Well, we've got some down at the far end. We'll give that a try.
Michael, could you post in the chat a link to the Pawpaw Festival?
Sure, happy to.
Okay. Let me see. Are there any productive plants or pollinator plants for deeper shade? Do you want to try that one, Jenny?
Well, I think there's all kinds of pollinator plants that really like the shade. You could try something like the golden ragwort. The Latin name is Chrysogonum virginianum. That's a nice early spring bloomer when a lot of the other berry producing shrubs are blooming in the neighborhood. So that would be useful. There's a good number of the mountain mint that I mentioned earlier, Pycnanthemum muticum, really does tolerate like a wide array of site conditions. So it does well in like a full sun environment, but it also does tolerably well in a deeper shade environment. I think that we've done a lot also with blue mist flower. It's in the Ageratum family. That's another one that I think attracts pollinators, has a nice long bloom period in the summer. And yeah, kind of tolerates like a heavier shade condition more so than some of the other things.
Great. Somebody's asking about the Green Infrastructure Network and finding out more about that. And we will be sending out a resource list to all the attendees, but maybe in the meantime, Jordan or Ted, you could post the Live Green Howard link for the gin in the chat. Somebody else is asking about how to employ an eco crew and where do I find them? And that will also come in the resources, but Jordan can also post that right now in the chat.
Yeah, I'll say a little bit about that, Lori. We enjoyed the experience so much that when I reached back out to Howard Ecoworks and asked if they did any kind of other work beyond just what we did in the project, and they had just started a program where you could rent a crew. And so they ran a holiday special, I think around Black Friday, I believe it was. And so I jumped on it, and I think I bought 3 4-hour blocks because I figured I can have them done in all that mulching we need to do in a day. So anyway, so yeah, that was, I'm looking forward to them coming back out for that.
Yeah, that's why you're our favorite farmer. Are there certain nut trees that produce each year and others that don't?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Many trees are what you call mast trees, meaning that they'll produce every second, sometimes every third year. A lot of oaks, hickories fall into that category. That's why something like the chestnut, being an annual bearer, makes it, very valuable for that consistency. Hazelnuts will produce every year as well. So yeah, it's a little bit different, and there is no real science to understand per se, around masting. It's still a bit of a natural phenomena, mystery. Takes some meditating maybe to understand.
Okay. Jenny, no, this might be for you. Can little blue stem be mowed?
I don't think it likes to be repeatedly mown in the growing season. I mean, you can. I don't think it would be a good lawn substitute. No, I think if you were looking to do a more natural lawn, you might want to look to some of the caryxes. There's oak sedge or caryx amphibola is another one that doesn't grow so tall and is maybe in the 4 to 6 inch height at full growth, and so it almost could disguise itself as a lawn that maybe is in need of a little haircut, but it won't get any taller than that. So little blue stem, I think, is one you just really want to focus on cutting back only once a season, and that would be late winter before the new growth pops out, and sort of like you can give it a little haircut then.
And we have big blue stem, we have little blue stem planted in our production fields, as well as, we have about 75 different species in those grazing fields. And we go through those about 3 to 4 times a year. And it seems to handle that type of grazing, but we usually leave about 8 inches of residual at least. So it's not being mowed like 2 inches or 3 inches to the ground, that kind of thing. So, but it seems to survive pretty well with that kind of pressure.
Okay, awesome. Somebody asked if there are any suggestions for native trees around septic beds. I believe we don't want to be planting trees on septic beds, but maybe do you have any suggestions for, are there shrubs that might work on septic beds or other species?
I mean, I don't know, Michael may want to chime in on this one, but in general, it seems like you want to, you know, when you're dealing with your beds there, you want them to really function well. I don't know. I think conventional wisdom would say try and stay out of that area with trees if you can. But Michael, I'll let you.
What comes to mind is blueberries. Blueberries are very shallow rooted. So there's a good potential there. And especially if you kind of created a raised mound, sort of a mini swale of sorts, you would be pulling yourself up even higher off of the septic area. And the blueberries would like that as well, as long as they can stay consistent. You know, they do like a lot of moisture. And when you find them in their natural settings, they're kind of in these bogs where water is threading through, but then there are these little islands where the water's moving around. That's where the blueberries thrive. So they have a little bit elevated, but the water nearby. So in some ways, maybe the septic zone could be good for something like the blueberry.
Okay. I'm not sure who this is directed to. Have you discussed using edible landscape plantings with California on their open space where they are amenable to converting it?
I think they mean Columbia Association.
Yeah. Okay, that makes more sense. We have not had that conversation with the Columbia Association from Howard Ecoworks perspective. But it's definitely a good idea. Okay, last question. My place is on top of a creek and has a high water table. Can I use a berm and basin to plant fruit trees? It's very sandy, so the drainage is perfect when I build up any mounds. So high water table,
yes,
berm and basin.
yes. You know, especially in a sandy soil, you know, lifting yourself above that high water table, again, similar to what I was just talking about with the blueberries, would work well in many ways, because the trees will have aeration on top of a berm, but yet they'll have access to that moisture below. The roots just want to have somewhere to breathe. So if you're worried about it being too wet, persimmons, mulberries, there's select mulberries. There's delicious grafted select mulberries that would do fine there. Again, the persimmons probably would not do pawpaw. Doesn't sound like a good site for pawpaw or chestnuts. Chestnuts also need good drainage. So I mean, potentially black walnut would do fine. And I'll add into that black walnuts. There are black walnuts that are pretty annual in their production as well. But you want to look for the right genetics in that. So not all black walnuts will be annual bearers, but there are some that are.
Okay, wonderful. There's one more that came in. If I just let my lawn grow all summer and simply mow or clear paths to sheds and other features like a gate, is that a beneficial start?
I would say yes. I think if you're able to do that and you won't get in trouble with your HOA or your community association, I think that is a great start. I think you can simply let it grow, and you may in fact be surprised to see that there may be things growing there other than just fescue and annual bluegrass rise. There's an immense amount of seeds in the seed bank below our turf lawns, and once they are given the right opportunities and not mown within an inch of their life, then I think you'd be you could see opportunities then for where you might want to add certain groups of perennials to the landscape if you know you're noticing that not everything is as desirable as you want. You can start to learn to identify what you want to keep in your lawn, turning into a meadow environment, and what you want to remove. But I think it's certainly a good way to start. Absolutely.
Okay. And I won't say it's our last question, because every time I say that we get another one. But the question is about ticks and how we control ticks when we're utilizing these types of practices in our homescapes.
So I can chime in on that one a little bit, but from a more agricultural side, Howard County does have regulations that allow backyard chickens, and so there are different types of poultry that can definitely benefit if you are interested in doing something like that. On the other side, I'll let other folks deal with that one.
I think that the previous question pointed out a good approach for handling that. You know, you can start with pockets of landscapes that are more overgrown. I don't want to say overgrown, but I'm stuck saying it. But that have a more dense planting to it. But then to maintain some kind of manicured or mown edge to these kind of plantings really benefits us from the perspective of, being careful of what ticks may be there. I know there's people who aren't too fond of some of the small rodents that may bother trees, so there's a reason to keeping a mown area around, say, a newly planted tree, or if you're not going to put like a guild around it or something, using mowing in a strategic way, I think is quite useful to keep pests out of the desired landscapes that we're creating.
And I think that also helps in the fact that if somebody was to complain, it shows that you are actually doing it in a managed way. It's not just you gave up on your lawn and you decide you aren't mowing anymore, that kind of thing. It gives you a little bit more of a defense. No, I'm doing this in a management way.
Yeah, absolutely. They call it like clues to care. You know, using an edging or a fence or a mown area does send a message to people that someone actually cares for this landscape still.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to the panelists for your time this evening. I hope I saw a lot of good feedback in the chat, so I think it was very informative for everybody. We're gonna just wrap up with a couple of announcements. Again, this presentation is being recorded right now, and we'll host it on our website for later viewing. We have a nursery at the Howard County Department of Corrections where we're growing native plants, and we do have a small selection of plants available right now that are for sale on our website. Their web link is there, howardecoworks.org/native plant sale, and we will be increasing the inventory that's available there over the spring. Next slide is an announcement about an event that we're having on March 6th from 10 to 12 in Ellicott City. It's a follow-on to an event that we had last year when we were featured on a Gordon Ramsay show for an extreme makeover of Ellicott City. So we're kind of reliving that, but in a more meaningful way by extending our efforts into the watershed and managing invasive vines and cleaning up trash. And we'll have teams all over the watershed doing some restoration and cleanup. And those tickets can be found on our website. We are hiring currently for multiple positions. We have even a staff position, we have an internship, and we are hiring for our spring crew, including a crew leader, assistant crew leader, and 4 or 5 crew members. So you can check that out on our website. And in addition, we are looking for our 2021 business sponsors to support our workforce development and environmental work. So if you own a business or you work for a business that may be interested in supporting our community work, we would welcome that opportunity and partnership with you. You can contact me or find more information on our website. Lastly, we hope you will follow us on social media. We're active on all of these platforms. We try to keep information out there in the public, and we'd love to have you engaged with us on our different channels. So again, everybody, thank you for all of your time today. Thank you again to our panelists for your time. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Stay safe out there. Stay healthy.
Yep.